Christmas goose. Roast goose was the traditional go-to Christmas meal for the US, England, and a lot of Europe for several hundred years, but it's not anymore. So what happened to that? Hi, I'm Sarah Tabor. I'm a small farmer, and I'm going to walk us through the journey of what happened to Christmas goose. There's a lot to unpack here. Raising geese is really different from raising other livestock, including other birds. Getting geese from the farm to the table can also be really different. And old-timey economics also have a lot to say on why goose was so popular and isn't anymore. One of the reasons that raising geese is way less popular than it used to be has to do with waxing, believe it or not. Not like the waxing in car, like you put on wax and you rip it up to pull things off of other things. We're gonna get into that. Don't worry, I will explain myself. But first, a little history of this tradition. Goose used to be so the thing you ate for Christmas, it showed up in a Christmas carol. You might have heard this one. Christmas is coming, the goose is getting fat. This song had been around for a while, but it got written down around 1885, 1886, Victorian era. So we're gonna focus on that time period. Now the song is super short, only 4 lines, and it still manages to tell us a lot about how Victorian economics made goose the go-to for Christmas. Something that even a lot of working class families could afford. And that is real different from today. If you want a Christmas goose, at least in the US, you're probably not going to find it in most grocery stores. You'll probably have to go online, and the cost can be eye-watering, triple digits for an 8 or 9 pound bird. Meanwhile, in the US right now, you can still get a 15-pound turkey for $30 or $40. I'm not gonna lie, I was expecting goose to cost more than turkey, but I wasn't ready for that much more. And that price difference is really weird because back in the day, turkey was the expensive luxury bird to put on your table if you really wanted to show off. So how did we get from goose being the affordable option and turkey is the expensive luxury bird to the complete opposite where we're at today? There are real answers to this, and they can actually tell us a lot about how agriculture and the world work. So let's get festive and unpack. So if people had to guess the reasons that we don't raise geese so much, people might start with they're mean. That must be it, right? I don't think so. We have domesticated geese twice. 2 different species in different parts of the world. Both of them are mean, and these geese have been domesticated for somewhere between 4,000 to 7,000 years. So the fact that geese are a little feisty is not what's been holding us back. Is it because geese are just too hard and challenging to raise? Also no. If that were the problem, we probably wouldn't have domesticated them 4,000 to 7,000 years ago. There are 3 things that make raising a goose really different from raising all the other big poultry species, you know, your chickens, ducks, turkeys. Geese are really different in 3 big ways. The first, geese need to be outside. For all those other things, free range is good, but for geese it is not optional. The second, geese just don't lay that many eggs, and that's going to affect how you can raise them. And the third is that geese eat grass. They don't have to, but it does help. For chickens, ducks, and turkeys, you can keep them in a pen, feed them grain, scoop out the poop, and they'll grow to maturity that way. It might not be the nicest way to do it. Free range, you know, having fresh air, room to run around is obviously very, very nice. But for geese, free range is not optional. If you try and raise geese in a pen like that, they are just not going to do well at all. So with geese, that entire approach to raising livestock is out the window. You just can't do it. And that's an economic hurdle in some ways that maybe we can explore in some depth later. But just for now, you can't do that. You do have to actually raise them outdoors. Geese do need shelter, and if you feed them grain, it really helps them get up to size in a timely manner, but they do need to be outside. The second reason, geese just don't lay that many eggs compared to chickens, ducks, and turkeys. There are chickens and ducks that can lay 200 to 300 eggs a year. So that means every mama bird can have 200 to 300 babies per year. So to create a big flock of chickens or ducks, you don't need that many adult birds to lay the eggs. But most domestic geese breeds will only lay 30 to 40 eggs per year, maybe up to 100. And they only lay those eggs in the spring and early summer. They know what time of year it is. With ducks and chickens, you can kind of use lights to fool them into thinking it's summer. I should be laying a bunch of eggs right now, so they can lay year round. But with geese, that just doesn't really work on them. Geese are better at knowing what time of year it actually is, maybe because they have to spend more time outside. You can't fool them with artificial lights quite as much. And the third thing that makes geese really different from ducks, chickens, and turkeys is they eat grass. They graze. Now, they're not going to gain weight very quickly if they're only eating grass. They also need bugs, seeds, that kind of thing. But geese can eat grass, which is really unusual for a bird. Now, a lot of grazing animals like cattle, sheep, they like tender grass, but they can eat the longer, tougher stuff. Geese really need the young, tender grass because geese don't have enough of the long, complicated digestive system that some of your 4-legged ruminants will have to break down the tougher parts of grass. So they really, really need the young, tender grass that's going to have a lot of sugar and protein in it, which is why when you go to a park or near a golf course and it's covered in geese and goose poop, that's why. Anytime you have lots and lots of fresh, young grass, that's like putting up a bat signal for geese. They love that stuff. That's the kind of grass that they need. If you're keeping a nice fresh lawn, you're just like throwing out the picnic blanket for geese. If you grow it, they will come. By the way, if you're liking this video, if you feel like you're learning something, go ahead and give it a like, subscribe, and comment. It really does help this info get out in front of more people. And if you're really liking it, there's a Patreon down below. So geese are just kind of a round peg in a square hole. Geese are larger and more aggressive, so they can defend themselves from predators a little better than most of your poultry livestock. They can forage for more of their own food, and it's really low-cost food. It's just grass. I don't want to oversell this, but you can almost think of geese less as your classic poultry livestock and more like a little tiny cow with feathers. If there's a spectrum of livestock with poultry on one end and cow on the other, they're kind of more in the middle than on the poultry end. All right, so knowing all of this about raising geese, that they only lay eggs really in the spring, they don't really eat grain, but they can run around and eat their own food, just get grass on their own, and that they don't even like being inside, can explain a lot about why they were the Christmas food of choice in, I don't want to say the pre-industrial era. Victorian England was extremely industrialized. Total side note, when you're talking about modern and the industrial era and agriculture, the timelines all get really messed up because agriculture mechanizing started in, the late 1800s, early 1900s, but industrialization itself goes way back further beyond that. So we're talking about old-timey agriculture in the Victorian era, which was a very industrialized time, and yet agriculture was not. So calling that part of history industrialized or not industrialized, it's not that simple. That's fun. Anyway, to take this back to geese, geese are an animal that is born in the spring, can take care of itself outside basically the whole year, fattens up in the fall, and is in prime eating condition just in time for Christmas. That's it. That's the whole thing. It's a low maintenance, can take care of itself animal that is just there when you need it. Chickens, ducks, and turkeys need to eat grain, and nowadays that's a plus because we can grow so much grain so quickly, so cheaply, that it's in many cases almost worthless. If we have all this extra grain, feeding it to animals that eat grain is a great way to make that grain worth something. So if you ever feel like the modern agricultural system is just about churning out a ton of grain and turning it into other things, meat, milk, eggs, ethanol, that is correct. So we have this whole rest of the farm economy that's almost just like a grain disposal system. That's kind of how the current food system functions. Nowadays, we kind of use livestock as a grain disposal system, but before the 20th century, you didn't really have a situation where there's too much grain, so we need to get rid of it. Historically, before the 20th century, you're more likely to not have enough grain to go around. And so what you don't want to do is raise livestock that's going to compete with people for grain. People need to eat the grain. The grain is for making bread. It is not for throwing at livestock. So before the 20th century, the ideal livestock was something that didn't need to eat grain. So that could be cattle, which can eat grain but don't have to. Sheep, hogs could eat scraps and garbage, and geese could eat grass, and a little bit of extra grains and scraps. This is part of why chicken used to be a treat. They eat grain, and that used to be a problem because they compete with people for grain that we need to eat. The other way that Victorian economics really come in here is going from a live goose to meat. Victorian economics have a lot to do with this one. Killing geese is hard, and it's not for the reason people would think, which is, oh, geese are mean, they're spicy, they fight back. That's not really it. And by the way, I really wish people would stop letting themselves get intimidated so much by geese. Geese like to bluff, they like to charge, they don't actually want to fight you because they know you're 10 to 20 times bigger than them. Walk with purpose, you're gonna be okay, all right? That's not the issue. The real issue is to go from animal to thing that's ready to cook, you gotta get rid of the feathers. It's the feathers. Feathers on a goose are really, really hard to get rid of. So let's talk about that and what that has to do with Victorian economics. So some animals, when we cook them, we want to take the skin off first. Beef, looking at you. You don't usually get pieces of beef with the skin still on. Poultry, especially waterfowl like ducks and geese, the skin has a lot of fat underneath it, which tastes really, really good, and also cooking it with the skin on helps the meat stay moist. So you don't want to get rid of the skin, you want to keep it on there, but you do want to get rid of the feathers. Because when you cook it, they get all black and crunchy and they smell like burning hair. It's not very nice. Gotta get the feathers off. That's tougher to do in waterfowl like ducks and geese than it is for chickens and turkeys. So let's talk through why. So usually when people want to get the feathers off a bird, we'll do this thing called scalding. A bird's feathers are kind of like the hair in your skin. They're kind of rooted in there. And so what you want to do is loosen that connection so they'll pull out. And that's what scalding does. It's not boiling temperature water because that's going to cook the skin and tighten it up. It's going to just denature some of the proteins in the skin so they start to let go of the feathers. And then depending on the bird, you can kind of scrape them off, or you can pull them out a lot more easily. The temperature for scalding chickens and turkeys is going to be 125 to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature for ducks and geese is going to be quite a bit higher, 145 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit, because their skin just hangs on to the feathers a lot more tightly. There's another reason. If you ever heard the phrase like water off a duck's back, ducks and geese have a lot of waterproofing oil in their feathers. And so, number one, that water has to be hotter to do the job, and number two, it's a lot harder to actually get the water through the feathers onto the skin where it needs to be to do its job. With a chicken, you can just kind of dunk it in there and like swirl it around a little bit, and the water will get to the skin. Ducks and geese, it's a lot more of a process. You got to really ruffle it in there. You want to put detergent in that water to help it get through the oils in the feathers, and you're going to need a lot more detergent to do that with ducks and geese. Plus, the water has to be hotter. I think you also just have to soak the birds in there longer for ducks and geese. Bottom line, the skin is hanging onto those feathers a lot tighter, and it's just harder to get the scald water to the skin to loosen the feathers up. So scalding them, which is like the key step in getting the feathers off a bird, is just a lot tougher with ducks, geese, and other waterfowl. Once you've done the scald step and loosened the feathers, then you can move on to the next step, which is plucking, just getting them out of the skin. There's a few different ways to do the plucking step. There's just plucking by hand, just kind of like pinch them out. That takes a long time. The way we usually do plucking right now, at least kind of at the small scale, is you'll have a drum, kind of like a washer, like a load from the top washer, with a bunch of foam fingers sticking out into the drum. You stick a bunch of birds in there, you whirl it around, and those foam fingers can kind of like grab onto the feathers enough to pull them out because they've already been loosened by the scalding step. It's funny too, because people talk about, like small scale pastured poultry, and then you just got these dead birds whirling around in a drum. Just not pretty. I don't know what to tell you. So for chickens, turkeys, that will get almost all the feathers out. You still usually need to pull a few out by hand, just get your extras. With ducks and geese, you can have a lot more feathers left over, and you have to pull those out by hand, especially the wing feathers, because they can be in there pretty tight because they're supposed to support the bird's weight while they're up in the air. So they're in there pretty tight. So you'll often have to go in there with some pliers and just pull them out individually by hand. Certainly for most of history, this plucking job was going to be done by hand. So that's just one of those things where if you're hiring people to pluck birds by hand, it really helps to have them be scullery wenches and child labor that you don't really have to pay much, because then you can afford to have people spend their days plucking birds by hand. So that's where the Victorian economics come into it here. And I'll point out, this little song about Christmas is coming, the goose is getting fat. The next line is, please put a penny in the old man's hat, because we have beggars. There's a lot of poverty. This is like a normal part of Christmas. We're going to give something nice to the beggars. And the next couple of lines are, if you don't have a penny to give the old man, a half penny will do. And if you don't have a half penny, God bless you. This is a cute little Christmas carol about poverty, widespread poverty, because wages are very low. This is a song about Victorian economics. We're eating geese and we're not getting paid very much to do all the work that it takes to do anything in this world. So that's how Victorian economics play into geese. And we're almost done talking about plucking. There's one last thing. Chickens and turkeys, they don't usually hang onto their feathers very tightly, so just a normal plucking will do. But geese and ducks especially will tend to have what we call pin feathers. So that's feathers that are just starting to grow out through the skin, and so they're not going to get caught in like your normal plucking process, right? They're just barely starting to peek through the skin. There's just not a lot to grab onto. So what you have to do for those is like a whole nother thing. I've cooked ducks a couple of times. If it's a small pin feather, I'll just leave it. It's not going to do anything. But if it's a big one that's just kind of like big and sticking out of there, I'll just get a pair of pliers and pull it out. That works if you only have a few pin feathers, but depending on where that goose is in its molt cycle, you might have like a lot of pin feathers. And just sitting there with some pliers, pulling them all out, could work for Victorian economics, but is not going to work for today's labor prices where we value human life and the time it takes people to do things. Can't really afford to do that. There is a quicker way to remove those pin feathers, and it is waxing. And if you're like, waxing? Do you mean like when you put wax on your skin and you whip it out to pull the hairs out? Yes, that's exactly the kind of waxing we're talking about. I've heard from a few people who have tried it and it got really mixed reviews. I've heard people say, it takes a little bit of practice, but once you get the knack down, it's good. And I've heard people say it was hopeless, I hated it, I'm never doing it again. I will point out that if you've ever waxed yourself, it takes some practice. Once you get the knack down, it's pretty simple. But figuring out the exact process is kind of a pain in the butt because you got to get the wax going in the right direction. You have to pull it off in the other right direction. And then you also need to make sure that it's hardened up enough before you try, or you just get like a bunch of goo and it doesn't grab anything. I've never waxed a goose or duck myself, but I imagine the same things come up here, right? There's also the temperature issue. Kill the bird, it is going to be body temperature, and then you scald it so it's going to get a little bit warmer, and then you need to get it cold. before you start that waxing part, and you probably need to get it dry so the wax can grab onto the feathers, right? So it's like a whole thing. Once you get the knack down, it should be quicker than pulling them out with pliers, but getting the knack down is some practice. And I am guessing, that if you have had practice waxing yourself, it might be a little bit easier to get the knack because you've done it before. But I don't think the Venn diagram of people who wax themselves and people who slaughter livestock is that large. I think that's part of the issue, is there's people who have waxing skills and there's people who slaughter livestock, and they don't really overlap a whole lot. I think that might be part of what we're running into here. The process of waxing geese, for those who have done it, they say it's a pain in the butt. I will point out that at least it doesn't hurt. The guy you're doing it to is already dead. So hey, there's that. By the way, if this seems a little bit all over the place, this is the first time the sun has come out in close to a week. I don't have quite enough lights to shoot and have it look good if there's not sunlight coming in from outside. And so the sun came out and it was like, oh, we have to go now. Get it together. We better wrap this thing up. Bottom line, how we raise food and how much work it is to do that can change for a lot of reasons. Like location. If you, say, go from England to the United States, like a lot of people did, the weather and the economy are going to be different. The passage of time can change things. If you give it a couple centuries, the weather's going to be a little different. And sometimes the weather can change faster than that if you, And technology and economics also play a huge role here. Today, agriculture is pretty automated, and the place where that shows up the most is grain. Grain used to be precious, and now it is so cheap. It's so cheap, we just feed it to animals. And even the animals are pretty affordable because the main ingredient to raise them, grain, is that low in cost. Now, this approach to agriculture is obviously not all unicorns and rainbows. We're talking labor issues, lots of manure in a small amount of space, and it's got us locked in to putting a lot of our land in just a few bulk crops for animal feed. And those crops have to be cheap because animal feed, and then farmers don't like that very much because it's so cheap that they're not getting paid much for growing those crops. These are extremely real problems, and a lot of people want to solve them. And some people want to solve them by going back to the way things used to be. Now, if you have watched any of my other videos, you know that I really believe in naming our problems, understanding them, and solving them. So I want us all to think real hard before we pick the way things used to be as the solution to these problems. And I'm going to bring this back to agriculture in a second because farming is a really important part of the way things used to be. And because this is the internet and we're talking the pitfalls of nostalgia and looking to the past for answers, before anybody goes, oh, now I can't have fun because a lady on YouTube said not to, it's okay to have a little festive nostalgia, right? Our town has a little Dickens Christmas Street Festival every year and it's super cute and fun. Nostalgia is perfectly fine entertainment. It's just not problem solving. And it's not something to get lost in. Because here's the way things used to be. Widespread poverty. A lot of the labor-intensive traditional ways of farming were possible because labor was super cheap, basically worth nothing. You could have someone slowly hand-pluck goose all day because you didn't really have to pay them, which sounds nice if you're thinking as the employer or the customer, but for 90+% of the population, those low wages were a life sentence. When you work for a living, time is all you have. So if you live in a time and a place where your time is considered worthless, that culture has also basically decided that you are worthless, that you do not deserve anything besides a life of poverty and toil. That's how Victorian England worked. And that's why, even in the cheerful little Christmas carols, the poverty is peeking through. It ruled most people's lives and their deaths. And it wasn't just low wages either. Food also cost a lot more than it does today. Families easily spent half their earnings on food. Never mind clothing, shelter, shoes. So when you're making practically nothing, and then you have to spend half of it just to stay alive, you are never going to get ahead. That's not just poverty, that's poverty for the next generation and the one after that. And the fact that grain was so precious and hard to come by was one of the main reasons that when England took over Ireland, they turned it into a grain colony to grow grain to ship to England, leaving very little space for Irish people to feed themselves. Victorian economics built the Irish potato famine just 2 short years after Dickens' A Christmas Carol. They are 2 parts of the same world. Now, what does this have to do with agriculture? Well, for us farmers, it is extra easy for us to get nostalgic about old times. And the reason for that is real simple. Labor was cheap and food was expensive. So farmers got paid more and hardly had to pay workers anything. Farmers didn't even have to take out big loans to buy expensive equipment because labor was so cheap you could just bring hordes of people to do the work for practically nothing. Or, in a lot of the world, including the US South, literally nothing. So it's no wonder that a lot of farmers and books and shows and social media about farming do lean so hard on nostalgia that we do get lost in it. But this nostalgia for old-timey farming lives at a very shallow surface level. We love to talk about traditional recipes and crops and how great they were and how we're missing so much without them and why we should bring them back. But we don't talk about the circumstances that actually made it all possible, that made, for example, Goose the go-to Christmas meal. We don't tell the audience we're selling this nostalgia too. Here's what it would actually mean for you and your children's future if this way of life were to come back. We wouldn't want to dwell on that now, would we? So that got really philosophical for a casual little history of the holiday video, but there is a reason that I talk so much on this channel about the nuts and bolts of agriculture and how it actually works as a trade, as a job. So if you're new to this channel, welcome, take a look around. I work really hard to bring you real information and make every minute worth your time. And as we celebrate holiday traditions this year, I hope you'll join me in appreciating the hard work and the sacrifice that people in the past made to get us here. Let's honor that by continuing their journey, looking at the problems in front of us and fixing those, not by losing our nerve and trying to rewind back to simpler times that millions of our ancestors gave everything to get us out of. Instead, let's follow their example by really getting to know the problems that are in front of us today, facing them with courage, doing the work to solve them, and moving our lives forward. Y'all do good out there.